There are few places in American history as quiet and as enduringly mysterious as the small English settlement that came to be known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke. Unlike stories filled with dramatic battles or legendary heroes, this one begins gently, with wooden ships crossing a wide ocean, with families hoping for a better future, with the soft sound of waves carrying people toward a coastline they had never seen before. Tonight, we will follow their journey slowly, carefully, and only as far as history allows. Where the historical record becomes uncertain, we will remain honest about what is known, what is likely, and what historians continue to debate. So settle into a comfortable place. Let the day gradually fade away, and together let us travel back to the late 16th century, long before the United States existed, when the Atlantic Ocean seemed almost impossibly vast, and the eastern coast of North America remained unfamiliar to nearly everyone living in England. In the late 1500s, England was changing. Its population was growing. Its merchants dreamed of new trade routes. Its sailors returned with stories of distant seas and unfamiliar lands. Across Europe, powerful kingdoms competed to establish colonies beyond the Atlantic. Spain had already built a vast empire across the Americas. Portugal controlled profitable routes around Africa and into Asia. England, however, was only beginning its own overseas ambitions. Among those who believed England should establish colonies was Sir Walter Raleigh. He imagined settlements that could strengthen England's influence, provide valuable resources, and serve as bases for future exploration. Like many ambitious ideas, it sounded promising on paper. Reality, however, would prove far more complicated. The first English expeditions reached the coast of present-day North Carolina during the 1580s. To the newcomers, the landscape must have seemed almost endless. Long, sandy islands stretched beside calm sounds and shallow waters. Dense forests reached toward the horizon. Birds filled the sky. Fish crowded the rivers and coastal waters. The land appeared rich with possibility. Yet beauty alone could not guarantee survival. This coastline was already home to indigenous peoples who had lived there for countless generations. They understood the tides, the forests, the changing seasons, and the delicate balance that allowed life to flourish. The English newcomers, by contrast, knew almost nothing about this unfamiliar environment. Every successful harvest, every safe source of drinking water, every pathway through the woods would have to be learned or shared. The first English settlements struggled almost immediately. Supplies often arrived late. Food became scarce. Relationships with nearby indigenous communities shifted between cooperation and conflict. The environment itself demanded patience that many newcomers had not yet developed. Eventually, those early attempts failed. But England did not abandon its dream. Instead, another expedition was organized. This new group would be different. Unlike earlier voyages focused mainly on soldiers and explorers, this expedition included entire families, men, women, children, people intending not merely to visit, but to build permanent lives across the Atlantic. In the spring of 1587, 3 small ships prepared to leave England. Their destination was the New World. Among the passengers was a man named John White. An experienced artist and mapmaker, he had already visited the region during earlier expeditions. His detailed drawings would later become some of the earliest visual records of the people and landscapes along the Atlantic coast. Because of his experience, he was chosen to lead the new colony. The passengers loaded their belongings carefully. Woodworking tools, seeds for planting, cooking pots, clothing, simple furniture, religious books, weapons for protection. Everything had to fit aboard the crowded vessels. Space was precious. The Atlantic crossing itself offered little comfort. For weeks, the ships rose and fell with the endless rhythm of the sea. Cabins remained cramped. Fresh food disappeared quickly. Drinking water slowly became stale. Storms occasionally interrupted otherwise peaceful days. Even under favorable conditions, crossing the Atlantic demanded remarkable endurance. Children spent most of their time below deck. Adults repaired equipment whenever possible. Sailors climbed towering masts despite strong winds, adjusting sails as weather changed. Every sunrise looked much like the one before. Only the direction of the wind hinted that progress continued. For many passengers, this voyage represented the greatest journey of their lives. Some had never traveled farther than neighboring villages back in England. Now they found themselves crossing an ocean that seemed almost endless. Yet hope remained stronger than fear. Beyond the horizon waited opportunity, or so they believed. As summer approached, the ships finally reached the familiar coastline visited during earlier expeditions. Low, sandy islands appeared first, then forests, then calm waters protected behind long barrier islands. The air smelled different, warmer, heavier with salt and pine. Seabirds circled overhead. The long voyage had ended. The difficult work was only beginning. The settlers came ashore carrying tools rather than treasures. There were no grand stone cities waiting to welcome them, no prepared fields, no comfortable houses. Everything they needed would have to be built from the ground up. The chosen location lay on Roanoke Island, protected from the open Atlantic by the Outer Banks. Today, the island appears peaceful, with quiet marshes, forests, and waterways. More than 400 years ago, it must have felt wonderfully distant. The settlers immediately began repairing existing structures left behind from earlier English attempts. Some buildings still stood. Others required complete reconstruction. Fresh timber was cut from nearby forests. Simple wooden houses slowly took shape. Fences marked small gardens. Storage buildings protected valuable supplies. Smoke soon rose from cooking fires. Little by little, the settlement began to resemble a permanent home. Life quickly settled into a demanding routine. At sunrise, workers gathered timber. Others searched for fresh water. Some prepared farmland. Others repaired damaged tools brought across the ocean. Children collected firewood. Women organized household supplies inside the unfinished homes. Every pair of hands mattered. Every hour of daylight was valuable. Despite the constant work, there must have also been moments of quiet satisfaction. A finished roof, a successful fishing trip, fresh bread baked after weeks at sea. Simple victories often carried the greatest meaning. Nearby, indigenous communities observed the newcomers with understandable curiosity. Some encounters were peaceful. Food and knowledge were sometimes exchanged. Other meanings remained cautious. Both groups understood that strangers had arrived. Trust, however, cannot be built in a single afternoon. It grows slowly. Sometimes it never fully grows at all. John White carefully documented much of what he saw. His sketches revealed villages, clothing, fishing methods, and landscapes like nothing most people in England had ever imagined. Today, historians value these observations because they provide rare glimpses into life along the Atlantic coast before permanent English colonization transformed the region. As summer continued, one remarkable event quietly unfolded inside the growing settlement. A child was born. Her name was Virginia Dare. She became the first English child known to have been born in the Americas. To her parents, she was simply a daughter. To history, she would become a lasting symbol of hope and eventually of mystery. No one celebrating her birth could possibly imagine the questions that would surround her name for centuries to come. For now, however, life continued peacefully. Homes slowly improved. Gardens expanded. Fishing provided fresh meals. Children laughed between unfinished buildings. The colony remained small, fragile, but hopeful. No one yet realized that this quiet settlement would one day become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history, and the first steps toward that mystery had already begun. In the next part, we will quietly follow Governor John White as an unexpected decision forces him to leave the colony behind, beginning a chain of events that history has never been able to fully explain. The summer days passed gently on Roanoke Island. Warm sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees, and soft breezes carried the scent of salt water across the growing settlement. Each morning, smoke rose from the chimneys of the newly built wooden houses. Gardens slowly began producing vegetables. Fishing boats returned with fresh catches from the nearby sounds. At first glance, the colony appeared to be finding its rhythm. The settlers worked from sunrise until evening. Carpenters repaired buildings damaged by wind and rain. Farmers cleared additional land for planting. Women preserved food whenever possible, knowing that every meal carefully saved today might become essential months later. Children explored the sandy paths connecting the small houses, often stopping to watch birds feeding along the quiet shoreline. Life remained difficult, but it also carried moments of peace. The colony was just over 100 people. Most had left behind familiar villages in England with the hope of beginning again in a place filled with possibility. Some dreamed of prosperous farms. Others imagined profitable trade. Many simply hoped for a safer future for their families. Yet, beneath this hopeful routine, problems quietly continued to grow. The settlement's food supplies had been carefully calculated before leaving England, but crossing the Atlantic had consumed more provisions than expected. Some barrels had spoiled during the voyage. Others had been damaged by seawater. The gardens planted on Roanoke would eventually provide food, but not immediately. Harvests require patience. People, unfortunately, cannot stop eating while crops slowly grow. The settlers also depended on relationships with nearby indigenous communities. These communities possessed generations of knowledge about the local environment. They understood where fish gathered during different seasons. They knew which plants could be safely eaten. They recognized changes in weather long before newcomers noticed them. Without such knowledge, survival became much harder. At times, cooperation proved possible. Food was traded. Information was shared. Simple acts of kindness crossed cultural boundaries. But trust remained fragile. Earlier English expeditions had damaged relationships in the region through misunderstandings and violence. Those memories had not disappeared simply because a new group of settlers had arrived. History often moves slowly. Communities remember, even when individuals change. Governor John White understood these challenges better than most. He had visited this coastline before. He knew that careful leadership would be essential. Every decision mattered. Every misunderstanding carried consequences. As the weeks passed, another concern became increasingly difficult to ignore. The colony desperately needed additional supplies. More food, more farming equipment, more clothing, more building materials. The settlers had arrived with determination, but determination alone could not replace missing resources. After careful discussion, a difficult decision was made. Someone would have to sail back to England. The colony needed help, and John White, as governor, was the obvious choice. No one welcomed the idea. Leaving meant separating families. It meant crossing the Atlantic once again. Most importantly, it meant leaving a young settlement without its leader. Still, the alternatives appeared even more dangerous. If fresh supplies did not arrive soon, the colony's future would become increasingly uncertain. John White himself faced an extra painful choice. His daughter, Eleanor Dare, remained in the colony. So did his newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare. He would leave behind not only neighbors and fellow settlers, but his own family. It is difficult to imagine that moment, standing beside the shoreline, looking toward the waiting ship, knowing that the journey ahead would be long, hoping it would also be brief. Perhaps White promised to return before winter. Perhaps he reassured his daughter that everything would be fine. No written record preserves those private conversations, but any parent or grandparent can imagine the emotions that must have filled those final hours together. The ship departed from Roanoke later that summer. Slowly, its sails disappeared beyond the barrier islands and into the Atlantic. Those remaining watched until the vessel became only a small white shape against the distant horizon. Then it vanished completely. The colony returned to its daily routine. Life could not stop simply because someone had left. The gardens still needed tending, the houses still required repair, fishing continued, children continued growing. Days turned into weeks. The settlers waited confidently for White's return. None of them expected the delay that history was about to deliver. Back in England, events beyond anyone's control began unfolding. Political tensions between England and Spain had been increasing for years. By 1588, those tensions erupted into open conflict. The mighty Spanish Armada prepared to invade England. Every available English ship became valuable for national defense. Merchant vessels, private ships, even those intended for colonial voyages. The English government focused almost entirely on protecting their homeland. In comparison, the distant colony across the Atlantic suddenly seemed far less urgent. John White desperately tried to organize a return expedition. Again and again, he searched for ships willing to make the dangerous voyage. Again and again, circumstances prevented departure. Some ships were needed for military service. Others feared Spanish attacks. Still others simply refused the financial risk. Months passed, then more months. White remained trapped in England while the people on Roanoke waited across an ocean with no way of knowing why help had not arrived. He later wrote of his frustration, his concern for his daughter, his worry for his granddaughter, his uncertainty about the fate of every person he had left behind. Imagine the helplessness he must have felt, knowing exactly where his family waited, knowing they expected him to return, yet being unable to reach them. Meanwhile, life on Roanoke almost certainly continued. The settlers likely harvested crops. They repaired houses before winter. They searched for food. They adapted as best as they could. History, however, grows unusually quiet during this period. No journals from the colonists survive. No letters cross the Atlantic. No detailed record tells us how they spent those long months. We know they lived. We know they waited. Beyond that, the historical record becomes remarkably silent. Silence itself can be unsettling, not because it proves disaster, but because it leaves room for countless unanswered questions. Did the settlers remain hopeful? Did they expect White's ship every morning? Did they begin considering other options? Without written accounts, we cannot know. We can only imagine ordinary people facing extraordinary uncertainty. As another season passed, the forests around Roanoke changed with the weather. Leaves turned from green to gold. Cooler winds swept across the island. Migrating birds filled the skies before heading south. Nature continued following its ancient rhythm. The colony remained part of that landscape, waiting quietly beside the water. Far away in England, John White continued searching for any opportunity to return. He could not have known that each passing month was carrying both him and the colony toward one of history's greatest mysteries. For now, the Atlantic lay between them, wide, silent, unforgiving. And every sunrise on Roanoke arrived without the sails the settlers hoped to see. In the next part, we will quietly follow the colony through the long years of waiting before John White finally returns to Roanoke and finds something no one expected. The Atlantic Ocean has a way of changing the meaning of time. For someone waiting on shore, a single day can feel long. A week can feel uncertain. A month can begin to test even the strongest hope. For the settlers on Roanoke Island, the passing seasons slowly transformed waiting into something much heavier. At first, Governor John White's absence probably did not seem alarming. Ocean voyages often lasted longer than expected. Storms could delay ships. Strong winds might force captains to wait in safe harbors before continuing their journey. The colonists understood these realities. Many had just crossed the Atlantic themselves. Patience was simply part of life. So they waited. Each morning, someone may have looked toward the eastern horizon. Each evening, another person may have wondered whether a sail would appear tomorrow. Life continued because it had to. Gardens needed attention. Fishing nets required repair. Firewood had to be gathered before colder weather arrived. Children continued growing. The seasons never paused for uncertainty. Autumn settled gently across Roanoke Island. The forest surrounding the settlement slowly changed color. Golden leaves drifted through the cool afternoon air. Migrating birds gathered overhead before beginning their long journey south. The rivers remained full of fish. The nearby sounds reflected calm skies that often seemed peaceful enough to erase every worry. Nature appeared generous, yet experienced settlers knew that winter always demanded preparation. Every piece of food became valuable. Corn harvested from the fields had to be carefully stored. Fish were dried over slow fires. Fresh meat was smoked to preserve it for the colder months ahead. Wooden barrels filled with clean water stood beside the houses. Firewood piles grew taller every week. No one could predict exactly when help would arrive. The colony had to depend upon itself. Among the settlers was little Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. She remained too young to understand the concerns surrounding the adults. To her, Roanoke was simply home. The sandy paths, the tall pine trees, the gentle sound of waves reaching the shore. She had never seen England. She had never crossed the ocean. Her world existed entirely on this quiet island. Perhaps that simple reality offered moments of comfort to her family. Even during uncertain times, children often remind adults to keep living one ordinary day at a time. Meanwhile, the colony's relationships with nearby indigenous communities remained extremely important. The Algonquin-speaking peoples living throughout the region possessed generations of knowledge about the local environment. They understood which plants could survive changing seasons. They recognized the best fishing grounds. They knew how to move safely through forests, marshes, and waterways that remained unfamiliar to the English newcomers. Modern historians believe that cooperation between the colonists and nearby communities likely continued in various forms. Trade may have taken place. Knowledge may have been shared. Food may have been exchanged. The historical record simply does not preserve every ordinary interaction. History often remembers conflict more easily than cooperation. Yet, everyday survival usually depends far more upon peaceful relationships than dramatic events. As winter slowly approached, life almost certainly became more demanding. Strong coastal winds swept across the island. Rain fell more frequently. Cold mornings arrived wrapped in thick fog, drifting across the marshes. Inside the wooden houses, families gathered around fireplaces whose warmth filled the small rooms with the comforting smell of burning oak. Candles flickered softly against rough wooden walls. Stories were likely shared during the long evenings, memories of England, dreams for the future. Perhaps conversations about when John White might finally return. Hope rarely disappears all at once. It slowly adjusts itself to changing circumstances. Far across the Atlantic, however, John White continued facing obstacle after obstacle. England remained deeply involved in defending itself against Spain. Ships that might have carried supplies to Roanoke were instead assigned to military service. Captains feared Spanish warships. Merchants hesitated to risk expensive cargo. Every attempt to organize a relief voyage encountered another delay. White grew increasingly desperate. His journals reveal his determination to return. Again and again, he searched for opportunities. Again and again, those opportunities vanished. The distance separating him from Roanoke remained unchanged. Thousands of miles of open ocean, weeks of dangerous sailing, no reliable communication, no certainty, only hope. By the time another spring arrived, the settlers had likely adapted as best they could. Gardens would have been planted once more. Fishing resumed as warmer weather returned. The forests filled again with birdsong. Life moved forward despite unanswered questions. History gives us almost no details about these months. That silence has encouraged countless theories over the centuries. Some suggest the colony remained healthy. Others imagine growing hardship. Some believe many settlers integrated peacefully with neighboring indigenous communities. Others suspect disease or conflict reduced their numbers. The truth is remarkably simple. We do not know. Responsible history accepts uncertainty when evidence is missing, and sometimes uncertainty itself becomes one of the most important parts of the story. During the second summer after White's departure, no English ship appeared on the horizon. The colony remained isolated. If the settlers had expected help quickly, they now understood they would need to depend almost entirely upon themselves. Perhaps new leaders emerged naturally within the community. Perhaps decisions were made collectively by experienced families. Small settlements often survive through cooperation rather than formal authority. Each day required practical choices. Where should food be gathered? How much grain should be saved? Which buildings needed repair first? How could every resource be used wisely? These quiet decisions, repeated day after day, shaped the survival of every community. Years passed more slowly than anyone had imagined. Then, at last, an opportunity appeared. In England, conditions finally allowed John White to join another voyage across the Atlantic. The journey remained dangerous. Storms still threatened the ships. Navigation across the ocean demanded great skill. Yet at last, after nearly 3 years away, White was sailing towards Roanoke once again. Imagine his thoughts during those long weeks at sea. He must have pictured the settlement countless times. Perhaps he imagined new houses standing proudly beside the old ones. Perhaps he imagined Virginia Dare, no longer a baby, but a lively young child running between the gardens. Perhaps he wondered whether his daughter still watched the shoreline each morning, hoping to see his ship. Hope can survive astonishingly long journeys. As the expedition approached the familiar coastline in August of 1590, excitement quietly spread among the crew. The barrier islands appeared once again. The forests stretched beyond them. The waters looked exactly as White remembered. Soon, he believed, he would step ashore and embrace his family. The colony was finally within reach. But the shoreline ahead appeared strangely quiet. No smoke drifted upward from cooking fires. No boats moved across the nearby waters. No voices carried through the evening air. From the deck of the approaching ship, something immediately felt different. No one yet understood why, But the silence waiting on Roanoke Island was unlike anything John White had expected to find. In the next part, we will quietly step ashore with John White as he discovers the abandoned settlement and the single mysterious word that has puzzled historians for more than 400 years. By the evening of August 18th, 1590, John White's ship had reached the familiar waters surrounding Roanoke Island. For nearly 3 years, he had imagined this moment countless times. He had pictured smoke rising from the chimneys, children running between the houses, friendly voices calling from the shoreline. Most of all, he had imagined seeing his daughter, Eleanor Dare, and his young granddaughter, Virginia Dare, alive and waiting. Instead, the island greeted him with silence. The ship anchored carefully offshore. The crew waited until it was safe to lower a small boat into the water. White's heart must have been racing. Every passing minute felt longer than the months that had kept him away. As the small boat approached land, something immediately seemed unusual. No one stood waiting on the beach. No welcoming fires burned along the shoreline. No signs of daily life appeared among the trees. Only the gentle sound of waves reached the boat as it drifted toward the sand. The landing itself was peaceful, too peaceful. The men stepped ashore carrying weapons, not because they expected immediate danger, but because uncertainty demanded caution. The familiar paths leading inland still existed. Tall grass had begun growing across some of them. Branches lay scattered where no one had cleared them away. Nature had quietly started reclaiming the settlement. White walked ahead with growing concern. Every step carried him closer to answers he had waited years to receive. Yet every step also deepened the mystery. The first building slowly appeared through the trees, or rather, what remained of them. Several houses were gone. Others had collapsed. Wooden fences had fallen into disrepair. Gardens that once promised fresh harvests had disappeared beneath wild plants. The settlement was empty, completely empty. No voices, no movement, no smoke, no animals belonging to the colonists, nothing. For a long moment, the only sounds were wind moving through the pine trees and waves breaking gently along the distant shore. Imagine standing there after crossing an entire ocean to find only silence. White immediately began searching every corner of the settlement. Perhaps everyone had moved temporarily. Perhaps they had relocated nearby. Perhaps they had gathered food inland. Reason offered many hopeful possibilities, but each passing hour made those possibilities seem less likely. Inside the remaining structures, there were surprisingly few signs of panic. Furniture was missing, many belongings had disappeared, storage areas had been emptied, important tools were gone. Nothing suggested a hurried escape. If the settlers had been forced to flee suddenly, historians would expect to find valuable possessions left behind: heavy equipment, household goods, food containers. Instead, much of the colony appeared carefully packed. That detail has become one of the most important clues in the entire mystery. It suggested planning, not chaos; preparation, not panic. As White continued searching, he remembered an agreement made years earlier before leaving for England. If the settlers ever decided to move somewhere else, they were supposed to leave a message carved into a tree or post, indicating where they had gone. If they had been forced to leave because of danger, they would also carve a small cross beside the message. The cross would serve as a warning. White desperately hoped such a message existed. Slowly, the search continued. Then someone noticed it. On one of the wooden fence posts surrounding the old settlement, several letters had been carved deeply into the wood. C-R-O. Only 3 letters. Incomplete. Perhaps the carving had never been finished. Perhaps weather had damaged it. Or perhaps it was only the beginning of a longer word. White examined it carefully. Nearby, another discovery waited. On the trunk of a large tree, one complete word had been carved with remarkable care. Croatoan. No cross appeared beside it, only the word itself. Simple, clear, deliberate. Today, that single word remains one of the most famous clues in American history. But in that moment, it was not mysterious to White John. He immediately recognized its meaning. Croatoan referred to a nearby island and to the indigenous people living there. The island, known today as Hatteras Island, lay south of Roanoke. White already knew the area. The Croatoan people had generally maintained more peaceful relationships with the English than some other neighboring groups. If the settlers had chosen to relocate, Croatoan seemed like a reasonable destination. Most importantly, the missing cross offered reassurance. According to the agreement, its absence suggested that the move had not been made under immediate threat. The settlers apparently left voluntarily. For the first time since arriving, White allowed himself a measure of hope. Perhaps everyone was alive. Perhaps they had simply moved to a safer location after waiting years for supplies that never came. If that were true, he only needed to continue searching. The answer might be only a short voyage away. Unfortunately, history had one more obstacle waiting. The weather began changing rapidly. Strong winds swept across the coastline. Dark clouds gathered above the Atlantic. Experienced sailors recognized the signs immediately. A dangerous storm was approaching. White urged the ship's captain to sail toward Croatoan immediately before conditions worsened. The captain hesitated. The crew had already endured difficult weather during the Atlantic crossing. The ships themselves needed protection. Anchoring near unfamiliar waters during an approaching storm carried enormous risks. As conditions deteriorated, the decision became unavoidable. The expedition could not safely continue. Reluctantly, preparations were made to leave. Few moments in early American history feel as heartbreaking as this one. John White had finally reached the colony after years of waiting. He had discovered evidence suggesting his family might still be alive only a short distance away. Yet violent weather prevented him from completing the final stage of the search. Standing once more on the shoreline, White looked back toward the abandoned settlement. Somewhere beyond the southern horizon lay Croatoan. Perhaps his daughter waited there. Perhaps Virginia Dare, now a little girl nearly 3 years old, played among entirely different surroundings. He could not know. The storm grew stronger. The ships raised their anchors. Slowly, painfully, they turned away from Roanoke Island. John White would never see the colony again, nor would he ever learn with certainty what had happened to his family. From that moment forward, the mystery passed beyond the lives of the people who experienced it. It became a question for future generations, a puzzle preserved not through dramatic battles or grand monuments, but through one abandoned settlement, one carved word, and an ocean of unanswered possibilities. In the next part, we will quietly explore what historians believe may have happened after the settlers left Roanoke, and why the word Croatoan remains the strongest clue ever discovered. The abandoned houses on Roanoke Island have captured imaginations for more than 4 centuries. Yet perhaps the most important clue was never hidden at all. It was carved openly into wood. One word: Croatoan. Unlike many historical mysteries, this clue was not discovered generations later by archaeologists. John White saw it with his own eyes in 1590. He recognized it immediately. And for a brief moment, he believed the mystery might already be solved. To understand why, we must first understand who the Croatoan people were. Long before English ships crossed the Atlantic, indigenous communities had lived throughout the coastal regions of present-day North Carolina. These communities understood the rhythms of the tides, the movement of fish, the changing seasons, and the forests that stretched across the islands and mainland. They built villages carefully suited to the local environment. They traveled by canoe through winding waterways. They farmed, hunted, and fished according to knowledge passed down through countless generations. Among these communities were the Croatoan people. Unlike some neighboring groups whose relationships with the English had become strained, the Croatoans generally maintained friendlier contact with the settlers. Communication had never been perfect. Cultures remained very different, but cooperation had often proved possible. Food had been shared, information exchanged. Guides had occasionally helped English explorers navigate unfamiliar territory. From John White's perspective, Croatoan represented one of the safest destinations the colonists could have chosen. The island itself lay roughly 50 miles south of Roanoke. Today, that distance may seem modest. Under favorable weather, it could often be reached within a day. To 16th-century settlers, however, even short coastal journeys required careful planning. Changing tides, shifting sandbars, and sudden storms made every voyage uncertain. Still, if the colony had decided to relocate, Croatoan was entirely within reach. Modern historians often ask an important question: why would the settlers abandon Roanoke at all? The answer may lie in the practical realities of survival rather than in any dramatic disaster. By the time John White failed to return as expected, the colonists had already waded through months of uncertainty. Then another year passed, then another. Food remained limited, supplies gradually wore out, metal tools became increasingly difficult to repair. Clothing slowly deteriorated. The colony could not depend forever upon resources brought from England. At some point, remaining exactly where they were may simply have stopped making sense. If nearby indigenous communities offered opportunities for trade, cooperation, or even permanent settlement, moving south may have been the most logical choice available. History often rewards practical decisions more than heroic ones. The colonists were ordinary people trying to keep their families alive. Survival likely mattered far more than preserving the original location of the settlement. This possibility helps explain another important detail. When White searched the abandoned colony, he found no evidence of widespread violence. The buildings had been dismantled in places rather than burned. Valuable belongings had been taken. Heavy wooden structures appeared intentionally removed, perhaps so useful materials could be reused elsewhere. Nothing suggested panic. Instead, the settlement looked carefully emptied. Imagine preparing to move an entire village. Families would gather their tools, cooking pots, seeds, weapons, fishing equipment, clothing, anything difficult to replace. Wood from abandoned buildings might even be carried away to construct new homes. The process would take time, organization, cooperation. Such a relocation would leave behind exactly the kind of quiet settlement John White eventually discovered. Not destroyed, simply abandoned. Over the centuries, archaeologists have searched for physical evidence supporting this theory. Some discoveries have proven intriguing. On Hatteras Island, where Croatoan once stood, researchers have uncovered English artifacts dating to the late 16th century. Fragments of pottery, metal tools, pieces of weapons. These findings suggest that English objects reached the area. The challenge lies in understanding exactly how. Did the Roanoke settlers move there permanently? Were the objects traded later? Did English explorers visit afterward? Archaeology often provides clues rather than complete answers. Every discovery opens new questions. Another possibility has attracted increasing attention among historians. Rather than remaining together as one large colony, the settlers may have divided into smaller groups.
Small communities often adapt more easily than large ones. Some families might have joined friendly indigenous villages. Others may have moved inland. Still others could have followed rivers searching for more fertile farmland. This would explain why no single large English settlement has ever been discovered after Roanoke. Instead of one destination, there may have been several. If this happened, the colony did not disappear overnight. It gradually blended into a changing landscape. People adjusted, children grew up, languages mixed, new traditions formed. History sometimes disappears not because lives end suddenly, but because lives quietly continue in unexpected ways. Early reports from later English explorers occasionally mentioned indigenous communities where some individuals appeared to possess European objects. A few accounts even described people with lighter features or stories of ancestors connected to earlier English settlers. Such reports have inspired generations of speculation. Modern historians, however, approach these accounts with great caution. Memories change over time. Stories evolve. Descriptions written decades after events may contain misunderstandings or exaggerations. Responsible history distinguishes between interesting possibilities and confirmed evidence. That careful balance remains essential. The mystery of Roanoke has survived precisely because historians refuse to claim certainty where none exists. It's tempting to imagine dramatic endings, secret battles, hidden treasure, impossible disappearances. But the available evidence points towards something quieter, something deeply human. A struggling colony making practical decisions in response to isolation. If that interpretation proves correct, then the settlers did not simply disappear. They adapted, they sought help, they found new ways to survive in a world far different from the one they had expected. As evening settled once again across the forests of coastal North Carolina, smoke may have risen from entirely different villages. Perhaps English children played beside indigenous children. Perhaps unfamiliar languages slowly became familiar. Perhaps Virginia Dare herself grew older beneath the same wide sky, though in surroundings her grandfather never imagined. History cannot confirm those details, but neither can it entirely dismiss them. The carved word on the tree continues to invite careful reflection, not because it provides every answer, but because it gently points towards the possibility that survival, rather than tragedy, shaped the colony's final chapter. In the next part, we will quietly explore the archaeological discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding of Roanoke, and why new evidence is still emerging more than 400 years later.
More than 400 years have passed since John White stood among the silent houses of Roanoke. The people he searched for have long since disappeared into history. The wooden homes they built have returned to the earth. The gardens they planted have vanished beneath forests and shifting soil. Yet the search for answers has never truly ended. Instead of sailors crossing the Atlantic, today's search is carried out by archaeologists. Instead of wooden ships, they arrive with maps, notebooks, ground-penetrating radar, and carefully measured excavation tools. Their goal is not to prove legends. Their goal is to understand ordinary lives that unfolded centuries ago. Archaeology moves slowly. Every layer of soil represents time. Every broken piece of pottery tells a small story. Every rusted nail raises another question. Unlike adventure films, real excavations rarely produce dramatic discoveries overnight. Weeks may pass before a single meaningful artifact appears. Months of work often result in only a handful of carefully documented objects. Yet those quiet discoveries gradually build a picture of the past. The Roanoke mystery is no exception. For generations, researchers focused primarily on Roanoke Island itself. If the colonists had remained there, evidence should still exist beneath the ground. Excavations uncovered traces of the original English settlement, fragments of pottery, iron tools, pieces of brick, animal bones, glass beads. These discoveries confirmed where the colony had once stood, but they did not explain where the settlers eventually went. The greatest challenge facing archaeologists is surprisingly simple: time. More than 4 centuries have transformed the landscape. Storms have reshaped the coastline. Rivers have changed course. Forests have expanded and retreated. Buildings made of wood disappeared long ago. Even entire shorelines no longer look exactly as they did in the late 16th century. Nature has had hundreds of years to quietly erase human footprints. Because of this, archaeologists rarely expect to find complete houses standing beneath the soil. Instead, they search for smaller clues: a cooking pot buried beneath fallen earth, a metal buckle, a piece of imported English pottery. These objects may appear ordinary, but together they reveal patterns of daily life. One particularly important discovery emerged during the 21st century. Researchers studying old maps created by John White noticed something unusual. One of his maps contained a small hidden symbol beneath an attached patch of paper. Modern imaging technology suggested that White may have marked the location of a planned inland fort. The possibility immediately attracted attention. If the colonists had moved inland, perhaps they had traveled toward that location. Archaeologists organized careful surveys. Excavations began. Among the discoveries were small fragments of English pottery dating to roughly the correct period. Known today as borderware, this type of pottery had been manufactured in England during the late 16th century. Finding it far from Roanoke Island was intriguing. Could these fragments have belonged to members of the Lost Colony? Perhaps. Could they have arrived through later English visitors? Also possible. Archaeology rarely offers simple answers. Instead, each discovery becomes one piece of a much larger puzzle. Another area receiving attention lies on modern Hatteras Island, the historical homeland of the Croatoan people. For years, archaeologists working there uncovered additional English artifacts: iron tools, gun parts, small trade items, pieces of ceramics. These discoveries strengthened the possibility that English settlers had indeed spent time among the Croatoans. Still, caution remained necessary. English objects do not automatically prove permanent English settlement. Trade alone can spread artifacts across great distances. One cooking pot may travel through many hands over many years. Historians therefore examine not only individual objects, but also where they are found. Patterns matter more than isolated discoveries. If numerous English household items appear together in one location, they suggest something different than a single object discovered alone. This careful approach protects history from wishful thinking. The Roanoke mystery has inspired countless books, documentaries, and novels. Some present imaginative explanations. Others introduce extraordinary claims without sufficient evidence. Professional archaeologists take a different path. They welcome possibilities, but they require proof. That patience sometimes disappoints people hoping for dramatic conclusions. Yet it also ensures that history remains honest. Modern technology has greatly improved the search. Ground-penetrating radar allows researchers to examine buried features without disturbing the soil. Satellite imagery reveals ancient landscape patterns invisible from the ground. Chemical analysis identifies where fires once burned or where buildings once stood. Even tiny fragments of pollen preserved beneath wetlands help scientists reconstruct the environment the settlers experienced. Every new method offers another opportunity to learn. Sometimes the smallest discoveries prove the most valuable. A broken spoon, a bent nail, a fragment of imported glass. These humble objects remind us that the Roanoke settlers were not mysterious figures living inside a legend. They were ordinary people. They cooked meals. They repaired clothing. They raised children. They worried about weather. They hoped for ships that never arrived. Their daily routines were remarkably similar to countless other communities throughout history. Only the silence surrounding their final years makes them appear unusual. Researchers also work closely with indigenous communities whose ancestors lived throughout the region. These communities possess histories passed down through generations. While oral traditions cannot always answer every historical question directly, they provide valuable perspectives often overlooked in earlier research. Today, many historians believe that understanding Roanoke requires listening to both archaeological evidence and indigenous knowledge. History becomes richer when multiple voices contribute to the story. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Roanoke investigations is that unanswered questions are not failures. They are invitations. Every excavation uncovers something new. Every season of research adds another careful observation. Bit by bit, the mystery becomes less about sudden disappearance and more about understanding how people adapted to extraordinary circumstances. As evening settles over the quiet fields where archaeologists carefully close their excavation trenches for the day, the landscape once again becomes peaceful. The wind moves gently through the trees. Birds settle into the marshes. The same stars that once shone above the Roanoke colonists appear overhead once more. Beneath the ground, countless stories still remain hidden, not waiting for dramatic discovery, simply waiting for patient hands and thoughtful minds willing to ask careful questions. And somewhere among those buried traces, the quiet lives of the lost colony continue to leave their faint but enduring mark upon history. In the next part, we will gently explore the many theories surrounding the lost colony and separate the evidence historians trust from the stories that have grown over 4 centuries of mystery. When a mystery survives for more than 400 years, stories naturally begin to grow around it. Some stories remain close to the evidence. Others drift farther away with each passing generation. The Lost Colony of Roanoke has inspired every kind of explanation imaginable. Books have suggested secret rescues. Legends have spoken of hidden civilizations. Fiction has imagined supernatural disappearances and impossible events. But tonight, we will remain where history is strongest, not because certainty is always satisfying, but because real history is often more fascinating than fantasy. The first theory is also the simplest. The settlers may have moved to Croatoan Island and gradually become part of the local indigenous community. Among historians, this remains one of the most widely discussed possibilities. It fits several known facts. John White found the word Croatoan carefully carved into a tree. There was no distress signal beside it. The Croatoan people had generally maintained better relations with the English than many neighboring groups, and archaeological discoveries on modern Hatteras Island have uncovered English artifacts dating to roughly the correct period. None of these facts prove the theory, but together they form a reasonable possibility. If the colonists joined the Croatoans, daily life may have changed slowly rather than suddenly. English farming methods could have blended with indigenous knowledge. Children might have grown up speaking more than one language. European tools may have been repaired using local materials. Families would have adapted to their surroundings one season at a time. History contains many examples of cultures influencing one another through cooperation rather than conquest. If Roanoke followed that path, the colony did not disappear. It transformed. A second theory suggests that the settlers moved inland. This idea gained renewed attention after researchers studied John White's maps and identified possible references to an inland fort. The mainland offered several advantages: fresh rivers, more fertile farmland, greater protection from powerful Atlantic storms. Perhaps the settlers believed moving inland would improve their chances of survival while they waited for England to return. Archaeologists have indeed found small quantities of 16th century English pottery at inland locations. Again, the evidence is intriguing, but incomplete. One broken bowl cannot tell an entire story. Even so, many researchers believe at least some members of the colony may have traveled away from Roanoke Island in search of better opportunities. Then there is another possibility. The colony may not have remained together at all. Imagine more than 100 people facing years of uncertainty. Different families might naturally develop different ideas about survival. Some may have wished to remain close to the coast. Others may have trusted nearby indigenous communities. Still others may have preferred exploring inland. Instead of one destination, there could have been several. This explanation also helps account for why archaeologists have never discovered one large replacement settlement. Perhaps there never was one. Perhaps the people quietly spread across the region, adapting to different circumstances. Over time, their descendants may have become part of entirely new communities. This idea reflects something historians often observe. Communities rarely make identical decisions. People respond differently to hardship. Some stay, some leave. Some seek familiar places. Others embrace entirely new beginnings. Not every theory, however, is supported by evidence. Throughout the 17th century, rumors spread that the colonists had traveled hundreds of miles into distant mountain ranges. Others claimed that they had crossed enormous rivers far beyond any documented English exploration of the period. A few stories even suggested impossible encounters with lost civilizations. Such accounts may be entertaining, but historians require more than imagination. Without reliable documents or archaeological evidence, these stories remain speculation. Responsible history welcomes curiosity. It also recognizes the limits of available knowledge. Perhaps the most dramatic theory proposes that the settlers all died suddenly through violence or disease. Certainly, life in the 16th century carried many dangers. Illness spread easily. Food shortages weakened communities. Conflicts sometimes occurred between different groups. No historian dismisses these possibilities entirely, yet there is an important reason why this explanation remains uncertain. John White found very little evidence of catastrophe. The buildings were not burned. Skeletons were not scattered across the settlement. Valuable belongings had not been abandoned in panic. Instead, the colony appeared carefully emptied. That quiet departure continues to shape how historians interpret the mystery today. Sometimes what is missing becomes just as important as what remains. Another fascinating aspect of the Roanoke story involves memory itself. Throughout the 17th century, later English settlers occasionally reported hearing stories about earlier English people living among indigenous communities. Some accounts described villages where European objects appeared unexpectedly. Others mentioned oral traditions about strangers arriving many years before. These reports have inspired researchers for generations. Yet once again, caution is essential. Most of these accounts were recorded decades after the colony disappeared. Human memory naturally changes over time. Details become uncertain. Events blend together. While such accounts deserve careful study, they cannot stand alone as proof. Modern historians combine these reports with archaeology, written records, and environmental evidence before drawing conclusions. That careful method protects history from becoming mythology. There is something quietly beautiful about this approach. Rather than forcing one dramatic answer, historians allow the evidence to speak gradually. Some questions remain unanswered. Others become clearer with each new discovery. Patience, after all, is one of archaeology's greatest tools. Perhaps the greatest misconception about the lost colony is the idea that it simply vanished overnight. The historical evidence suggests something much more ordinary. Communities under pressure often relocate. Families adapt. People make practical decisions based on survival. If Roanoke followed that pattern, then the mystery exists not because something impossible happened. The mystery exists because later generations lost track of ordinary people living ordinary lives under extraordinary circumstances. As twilight settles across the quiet waters surrounding Roanoke Island, it becomes easier to imagine the settlers making careful decisions beneath the fading light. Should they remain where supplies continue to grow scarce? Should they trust neighboring communities? Should they seek better farmland? No written record preserves those conversations, yet they were almost certainly discussed. Like families everywhere, the colonists faced difficult choices without knowing what the future would bring. Their voices have disappeared, their footprints have faded, but the questions they left behind continue to invite thoughtful exploration rather than simple answers. And perhaps that's why the mystery still feels so alive today. Not because history refuses to speak, but because it whispers only what the evidence can honestly tell us. In the next part, we will quietly step beyond the colony itself and explore the world surrounding Roanoke, its forests, rivers, and indigenous communities, to better understand the environment in which the settlers struggled to survive. To understand what may have happened to the lost colony, it helps to leave the empty houses behind for a while. Instead of focusing only on the English settlers, let us quietly explore the world that surrounded them. Because Roanoke Island was never an isolated place. Long before English ships appeared on the horizon, this coastline had been home to thriving indigenous communities for countless generations. They knew every river that curved through the forests. They understood the changing tides along the outer banks. They recognized the arrival of migratory birds each season. They knew where fish gathered in the spring, where oysters could be collected during low tide, and where deer crossed the forest as autumn approached. Their knowledge had been built slowly, over centuries. The English colonists arrived with courage. The indigenous peoples already possessed experience. Roanoke Island itself was unlike the places most English settlers had known. Rather than towering mountains or endless plains, the landscape consisted of barrier islands, marshes, dense pine forests, sandy beaches, and winding waterways. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly to the east. To the west lay calm sounds connected by rivers leading deep into the mainland. At first glance, the environment appeared peaceful, yet it demanded constant respect. Storms could arrive without much warning. Strong winds reshaped the coastline. Flooding sometimes covered low ground. Even experienced sailors could become trapped among hidden sandbars beneath shallow water. For local indigenous communities, these conditions were familiar. For newcomers from England, every season required learning. Spring brought warmer temperatures and new opportunities. Fish returned to the rivers in great numbers. Fresh plants began growing across the forests. Wild berries slowly ripened beneath the sunlight. Families repaired fishing nets and prepared fields for planting. The land became generous again after winter. Summer, however, introduced different challenges. The air grew hot and humid. Mosquitoes filled the marshes. Thunderstorms rolled inland from the Atlantic, sometimes bringing heavy rain and dangerous lightning. Travel became more difficult under the intense heat, yet crops also grew quickly during these long days. Autumn was perhaps the most comfortable season. The forests turned shades of gold and deep red. Game animals became easier to hunt. Corn reached maturity. Food could finally be harvested and stored before winter arrived. This season often determined whether a community would survive the colder months ahead. Winter along the North Carolina coast was milder than the harsh winters of northern Europe. Snow rarely remained for long. Yet the season still brought hardship. Cold rain chilled the body more deeply than many people expected. Strong winds swept across open water. Fishing became less predictable. Stored food became increasingly valuable. For settlers already facing uncertain supplies, every winter demanded careful planning. The English colonists slowly began realizing something important. Many of the survival techniques they had learned in England simply did not work here. Different soil required different farming methods. Local plants were unfamiliar. Native wildlife behaved differently. Even the weather followed patterns they had never experienced before. Adaptation became essential. This is one reason historians believe cooperation with indigenous communities was so valuable. Local knowledge could mean the difference between success and failure. Simple advice about where to fish, when to plant crops, which paths remain dry after heavy rain. These practical lessons often mattered far more than expensive tools brought from Europe. Among the indigenous peoples living in the region were several communities connected through trade, family relationships, and shared languages. Although each village maintained its own leadership and traditions, communication between neighboring groups was common. Trade routes stretched across rivers and forests. Goods moved from village to village. Shells, copper, stone tools, animal skins, food. Ideas traveled alongside them. The English settlers entered a landscape already connected by networks that had existed for generations. To the newcomers, the region may have appeared wild. To those already living there, it was home. John White himself recognized much of this complexity. His watercolor paintings remain among the most valuable historical records from the period. Rather than focusing only on English activities, he carefully painted indigenous villages, clothing, farming methods, fishing techniques, and ceremonies. His work reveals communities that were organized, skilled, and deeply connected to their environment. Modern historians continue studying these paintings because they preserve details unavailable anywhere else. They remind us that the history of Roanoke is not only an English story, it is also an indigenous story. Understanding both perspectives creates a fuller picture of the past. Imagine walking through the forests surrounding Roanoke 400 years ago. Tall pines would rise overhead. Sunlight would filter through branches onto narrow paths below. Birdsong would echo between the trees. Fresh streams crossed the landscape before flowing quietly toward the sounds. At night, the sky would appear remarkably clear, untouched by modern lights. Countless stars reflected across calm water. For the settlers, these surroundings were both beautiful and unfamiliar. For the indigenous communities, they represented generations of memory. Every tree, every river bend, every shoreline carried meaning shaped by experience. This difference in familiarity may explain why survival proved so difficult for the English colony. The settlers did not lack determination, they lacked time. Building knowledge of a new entirely environment normally requires many years. The Roanoke colonists were expected to learn almost immediately. That expectation placed enormous pressure upon a relatively small community already separated from England by thousands of miles. As archaeologists continue studying the region today, they increasingly focus upon landscapes rather than individual buildings. Where did people gather fresh water? Which rivers connected different communities? How did changing coastlines influence travel? These questions help researchers understand how daily life unfolded. History is shaped not only by people, but by the environments in which they live. The forests surrounding Roanoke have changed over 4 centuries. Some rivers followed different courses. Storms have altered parts of the coastline. Yet much of the landscape remains surprisingly familiar. Standing there today, visitors still hear the wind moving through pine trees. They still watch birds crossing the marshes. They still see sunlight reflecting on quiet water. The same natural rhythms continue. Perhaps that continuity offers the greatest connection to the past. The colonists may be gone, the villages may have disappeared, but the land remembers in its own quiet way. As evening slowly settles across the outer banks, gentle waves continue washing against the shore, just as they did in 1587. The forests grow silent, the marshes fill with the sounds of distant birds, and somewhere within that peaceful landscape, the story of Roanoke remains woven into the land itself, not hidden by magic, but preserved by time. In the next part, we will gently follow the lives of the settlers after their disappearance from the historical record, exploring what everyday life may have looked like if they truly found new homes beyond Roanoke.
By the time John White returned to England without finding his family, the people of the Lost Colony had already passed beyond the reach of written history. No journal recorded their final days on Roanoke. No official letter described where they traveled next. No map marked the path they may have taken. From that moment forward, history became unusually quiet. Yet silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it simply means that no one remained to write the story. If the settlers truly left Roanoke voluntarily, what might life have looked like afterward? The answer begins not with mystery, but with ordinary human needs: food, shelter, safety, community. These concerns shape nearly every settlement throughout history. If the colonists chose to move toward Croatoan or another nearby indigenous community, the journey itself would have required careful preparation. Heavy furniture would almost certainly have been abandoned. Large buildings could not be carried away. Instead, families would have packed only the items most essential to survival: iron axes, cooking pots, farming tools, seeds, fishing equipment, clothing, religious books that held personal meaning. Everything else would remain behind. The move likely happened slowly rather than all at once. Children and older adults would have traveled carefully. Small boats probably carried supplies through calm coastal waters. Others may have walked along narrow paths between forests and marshes. The distance was not impossible, but it demanded patience. Every trip required planning around tides and weather. Imagine the colony during those final days on Roanoke Island, the familiar houses standing quietly beneath tall pine trees, gardens nearly empty after the latest harvest, smoke rising from the last cooking fires before departure, voices discussing practical questions rather than dramatic farewells. Who would carry the tools? Which route would be safest? How much food remained? History rarely records conversations like these, yet they are the conversations that shape real lives. When the settlers reached a new location, the work would begin again. Temporary shelters might be built first, simple wooden frames covered with available materials, cooking fires lit before sunset, fresh water located nearby, fishing grounds explored. Every successful settlement begins with small routines repeated day after day. Modern historians increasingly believe that if the colonists survived, adaptation would have happened gradually. English customs would not disappear overnight. Neither would indigenous traditions. Instead, practical cooperation would likely become part of everyday life. The English had metal tools. The indigenous communities possessed deep environmental knowledge. Each offered something valuable. History provides many examples of cultures learning from one another when survival depends upon cooperation. Often, children adapt faster than adults. A young child raised in such an environment might naturally learn more than one language. They would play with other children regardless of cultural background. They would grow familiar with forests, rivers, and coastlines in ways their parents never had time to master. If Virginia Dare survived into adulthood, her earliest memories may have belonged not to England, but entirely to North America. The forests would have been her childhood, the rivers her playground, the Atlantic her constant companion. Of course, no historical document tells us what became of her. Her name survives because of where she was born.
Her life afterward remains one of history's greatest unknowns. As seasons continued passing, the settlers themselves would have also changed. Clothing gradually wore out. Imported English fabrics became difficult to replace. New garments likely depended upon locally available materials. Wooden houses reflected local building techniques. Food increasingly came from nearby rivers, forests, and fields, rather than supplies brought across the Atlantic. Over time, daily life may have looked less English than it had when the colony first arrived. Adaptation is not the same as losing identity. It is simply learning how to survive in new surroundings. Generations throughout history have done exactly that. They carried memories of old homes while embracing new realities. Perhaps the Roanoke settlers followed the same path. There is another reason many historians consider this possibility realistic. The English government itself remained largely absent. After White's unsuccessful return in 1590, England did not immediately organize another large search for the missing colony. Political priorities changed. Financial resources were limited. Attention shifted toward new expeditions elsewhere. Years passed, then decades. The people of Roanoke slowly became a historical question rather than an active rescue mission. For those still living in North America, if indeed they survived, life would simply continue. Children would become adults. Adults would grow old. New generations would know the story of England only through memories shared by their parents and grandparents. Eventually, those memories themselves would soften. This quiet blending of histories may explain why archaeologists find the mystery so challenging today. People leave behind countless traces while they live, but over centuries, those traces become scattered. A broken cooking pot here, an iron tool there, fragments separated by time, weather, and changing landscapes. Rarely does history preserve complete stories. Instead, it leaves small pieces waiting to be carefully assembled. As evening settles over the coastal forests once again, it becomes easier to imagine smoke rising from homes no longer standing, children laughing beside unfamiliar rivers, families sharing meals beneath wide skies filled with countless stars. Nothing dramatic, nothing impossible, simply people building ordinary lives beyond the edge of recorded history. Perhaps that is the quietest lesson Roanoke offers us. Not every mystery hides extraordinary events. Sometimes history loses people because they continue living instead of disappearing. They adapt, they change, they become part of communities that later generations no longer recognize. Their names fade, their stories become scattered, yet their lives remain real. And somewhere beyond the silence of the written record, those ordinary lives continued for as long as time allowed. In the next part, we will gently explore how the mystery of Roanoke influenced later generations of explorers, historians, and archaeologists, and why its unanswered questions continue to shape American history today.
As the years passed, the people of Roanoke slowly disappeared from living memory. Children born after the colony vanished grew up hearing only fragments of the story. Some heard that a group of settlers had been left behind on a distant island. Others heard that they had joined indigenous communities. Many simply knew that a colony had been founded and then somehow lost. The details became softer with each generation. Memory has a way of doing that. It preserves the shape of a story while slowly blurring its edges. Meanwhile, England continued looking westward. New voyages crossed the Atlantic. New settlements were attempted. Some failed, others survived. By the early 16th and 17th centuries, permanent English colonies began taking root along the Atlantic coast, most famously at Jamestown. For many colonists arriving later, Roanoke became both a warning and a mystery.
It reminded them that the New World could not be conquered by optimism alone. Distance, weather, disease, food shortages, and unfamiliar landscapes could challenge even the most determined settlers. At the same time, the unanswered fate of the lost colony continued to spark curiosity. What had really happened? Why had no clear record survived? Could some of the colonists still be living somewhere inland? These questions never fully disappeared. The mystery grows larger. During the 1600s and 1700s, travelers occasionally reported hearing stories about people who claimed descent from earlier English settlers. Some indigenous communities possessed European objects that seemed surprisingly old. Other reports described individuals with features that English observers considered unusual for the region. Such stories spread quickly. But stories are not the same as proof. Historians today examine these accounts carefully, asking who recorded them, when they were written, and whether other evidence supports them. Some reports may contain genuine memories of early contact. Others may reflect misunderstandings, exaggerations, or simple curiosity. The challenge is separating possibility from certainty. That challenge lies at the heart of historical research. A new kind of search. By the 19th century, interest in Roanoke began changing. Instead of searching only for surviving descendants, scholars started searching for documents, maps, and physical evidence. Libraries were examined. Old letters were translated. John White's journals received renewed attention. People realized that the colony's story was not merely a local legend. It was one of the earliest chapters in the history of English settlement in North America. Then archaeology added another layer to the search. Careful excavations revealed traces of the original settlement: broken pottery, iron tools, animal bones, fragments of everyday life. These discoveries did not solve the mystery, but they transformed it. Roanoke was no longer a story floating between myth and history. It became a real place, inhabited by real people, whose lives left measurable traces in the ground. Why Roanoke still matters. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Lost Colony is that it continues to ask questions rather than provide answers. Many historical events end with clear conclusions. We know who won a battle. We know when a city fell. We know why a treaty was signed. Roanoke is different. Its ending remains partly hidden. And because the ending is hidden, each generation looks at the evidence with fresh eyes. Some see a story of failed colonization. Others see a story of cultural adaptation. Some focus on the dangers of isolation. Others focus on the resilience of ordinary people. All of these perspectives contain pieces of the larger picture. A quiet reflection. When you think about the Lost Colony, which idea feels most compelling? Most compelling explanation. Choose one. The settlers moved to Croatoan and integrated with nearby indigenous communities. They moved inland and formed smaller settlements. The colony gradually split into several groups. The most honest answer is that we still don't know. The view from Roanoke. Imagine standing on Roanoke Island at sunset. The marshes glow with soft golden light. Birds cross the sky in long, quiet lines. The Atlantic breathes steadily beyond the barrier islands. Nothing in the landscape announces a great historical mystery. That may be why the story feels so haunting. The place itself remains peaceful. Only the unanswered questions linger. Somewhere in those forests, rivers, and coastal islands, the lives of the settlers continued for a time, whether together or apart, whether among familiar neighbors or new communities. History can only see fragments of what happened next. Yet those fragments are enough to remind us that the past is often more complicated and more human than the legends built around it. As darkness slowly settles over the quiet waters of the Outer Banks, the mystery of Roanoke remains unresolved. Not because evidence is absent, but because the surviving evidence whispers rather than shouts. And sometimes, the softest whispers are the ones that endure the longest. In the next part, we will gently explore the strongest modern theory about the Lost Colony and follow the evidence that leads many historians towards a surprisingly hopeful conclusion.
As the centuries have passed, one important change has quietly taken place. The questions surrounding the lost colonies no longer simply, where did they go? Instead, historians increasingly ask a different question. How did they survive? This subtle change reflects decades of careful research. Rather than imagining one dramatic event that suddenly erased the colony, many scholars now see Roanoke as a story of adaptation, not a mystery created by magic, not a disappearance without explanation, but ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances. That idea may not sound as exciting as legends, yet it fits remarkably well with the evidence we actually possess. When John White returned in 1590, he found no signs of a violent attack. The buildings had not been burned. Weapons were not scattered across the settlement. There were no mass graves waiting to be discovered. Most importantly, valuable belongings had been removed. The settlers had taken what mattered most. Everything pointed toward a planned departure rather than a sudden catastrophe. For historians, that distinction is incredibly important. Communities forced to flee in panic leave behind one kind of evidence. Communities preparing for a careful move leave behind another. Roanoke appears much closer to the second example. Imagine living on the island during those difficult years after White sailed back to England. At first, everyone expected him to return quickly. Weeks became months. Months became years. Eventually, it would become impossible to ignore reality. No ships were coming. The colony could no longer depend on England. The settlers had to decide whether to remain where they were or seek a better future elsewhere. History suggests they chose movement over waiting. That decision would have required remarkable courage. Leaving behind homes that had taken years to build is never easy. Every wooden wall represented countless hours of labor. Every garden reflected months of careful work. Every familiar path held memories. Yet survival often demands difficult choices. Across history, families have repeatedly left homes they loved because remaining had become even more dangerous. The people of Roanoke were likely no different. One of the strongest clues supporting this idea comes from the carved word itself, Croatoan. John White immediately understood what it meant. Before leaving England, he had instructed the settlers to leave a message if they relocated. If they departed because of immediate danger, they were supposed to carve a cross beside the destination. There was no cross, only the word. That simple detail continues to shape modern historical thinking. It suggests intention, planning, hope, not fear. Another reason many historians favor the adaptation theory is something often overlooked. The indigenous communities of coastal North Carolina were not strangers to cooperation. Trade connected villages throughout the region. Knowledge moved alongside goods. When necessary, communities sometimes welcomed newcomers or formed new relationships. Although cultural differences certainly existed, survival often encouraged practical partnerships. The English possessed iron tools and certain European technologies. The indigenous communities possessed generations of environmental knowledge. Each group had something valuable to offer. Such exchanges had already begun before White departed. It is entirely reasonable to imagine those relationships deepening over time. Children may have played together. Adults may have worked together in fields or along fishing grounds.
New words may have entered everyday conversation. Different traditions may have gradually blended. History contains countless examples of cultures influencing one another without either completely disappearing. Perhaps Roanoke followed a similar path. One particularly fascinating area of research involves family histories. Over the years, some families living in parts of North Carolina claimed distant traditions connecting them to the Lost Colony. A few oral histories described ancestors who spoke of English settlers joining indigenous communities generations earlier. These stories are intriguing, but historians approach them carefully. Oral traditions can preserve valuable memories across centuries. At the same time, details naturally change as stories pass from one generation to the next. Researchers compare these traditions with archaeological evidence, historical documents, and modern scientific methods. No single source tells the entire story. Together, however, they create a richer understanding. DNA research has also attracted public attention. Many people wonder whether genetic testing might finally solve the mystery. The answer is more complicated than it first appears. Without confirmed DNA from members of the Lost Colony, direct comparisons remain extremely difficult. Centuries of migration, marriage, and population change further complicate the picture. Genetics may eventually contribute useful information, but for now, archaeology and historical documents remain our strongest sources of evidence. Perhaps the greatest lesson Roanoke teaches us is the importance of accepting uncertainty. Modern culture often expects every mystery to end with a final answer. History does not always work that way. Sometimes the surviving evidence simply cannot tell us everything we wish to know. Responsible historians resist the temptation to invent certainty where none exists. Instead, they build careful explanations based upon the strongest available evidence. That approach requires patience. It also requires humility. As the evening sun slowly disappears beyond the quiet waters surrounding the Outer Banks, it becomes easier to imagine the colonists looking toward the same horizon. They could not know that people 4 centuries later would still wonder about their fate. To them, each day was simply another opportunity to find food, protect their families, and prepare for tomorrow. Their greatest concern was survival, not becoming a mystery. Perhaps that's the quiet irony of Roanoke. The people who unknowingly created one of America's greatest historical mysteries were never trying to make history at all. They were simply trying to live. And sometimes, the most ordinary human struggles become the stories remembered the longest. In the next part, we will gently return to Roanoke Island itself and reflect on what visitors, historians, and archaeologists experience there today, and why the silence of the landscape continues to inspire thoughtful curiosity rather than certainty. 4 centuries have transformed Roanoke Island in countless ways. The wooden houses built by the English settlers have long since disappeared. The gardens they carefully planted have returned to forests and open fields. The narrow paths once worn smooth by hundreds of footsteps have been reclaimed by grass, roots, and time. Yet, despite all these changes, the island itself remains. The same Atlantic winds still sweep across the coastline. The same tides rise and fall each day. The same evening light settles gently over the marshes as it did in the summer of 1587. For many visitors today, that quiet landscape becomes one of the most memorable parts of the experience. There are no towering ruins reaching into the sky, no massive stone walls standing as dramatic reminders of the past. Instead, there is space, open sky, tall pine trees moving softly in the wind, calm waters reflecting the changing colors of sunset. History here speaks very quietly. Walking across the island today requires imagination, not because the facts are unknown, but because so much of ordinary life has vanished. A family preparing breakfast, children carrying firewood, someone repairing a fishing net outside a wooden house, neighbors discussing the weather before beginning another day's work. These simple moments rarely leave permanent marks behind. Archaeology uncovers fragments. History preserves names. But daily life often disappears almost without a trace. Perhaps that is why Roanoke feels different from many famous historical sites. It reminds us that history is not made only by kings, queens, or great generals. It is also created by ordinary people whose names rarely appear in books. Farmers, carpenters, parents, children. People whose greatest hope was simply to build peaceful lives. As archaeologists continue working in the region, they do so with remarkable patience. Every excavation begins slowly. The ground is measured carefully. Small squares are marked using strings and wooden stakes. Layers of soil are removed one thin section at a time. Nothing is rushed. Even the smallest discovery receives careful attention. A single pottery fragment may reveal where meals were prepared. A rusted nail may indicate the location of a long-forgotten building. Charcoal preserved beneath the soil can help researchers identify ancient fireplaces. Tiny seeds sometimes reveal which crops people once planted. History often survives through details so small they might easily be overlooked. Modern technology has added new possibilities to this careful work. Ground-penetrating radar allows scientists to examine buried features without immediately disturbing them. Drones photograph landscapes from above, revealing patterns invisible from ground level. Satellite images help researchers compare modern coastlines with historical maps drawn centuries earlier. Computer models reconstruct how rivers and shorelines may have looked during the 16th century. Each new method provides another piece of the puzzle. Yet even with these remarkable tools, archaeology remains wonderfully humble. Researchers understand that some questions may never receive complete answers. Coastlines change. Storms erase evidence. Wood decays. Time quietly reshapes everything. Rather than becoming discouraged, historians accept these limitations as part of their work. The goal is not perfection. The goal is understanding. Roanoke has also become an important reminder of how history itself changes. When people first discussed the Lost Colony centuries ago, many focused almost entirely on the English settlers. Today, historians recognize that the story cannot be understood without also studying the indigenous communities who had lived in the region for generations. Their knowledge shaped the environment. Their relationships influenced the colony's chances of survival. Their history continues long after the English settlement disappeared from written records. This broader perspective creates a richer and more balanced understanding of the past. It reminds us that every historical event involves many voices, not just one. The mystery of Roanoke belongs to everyone connected with that landscape, not only to those who arrived from across the ocean. Visitors often describe a surprising feeling when standing near the site of the colony. There is no sense of fear, no atmosphere of supernatural mystery. Instead, there is calm. The breeze moves gently through the trees. Birds call from nearby marshes. The ocean continues its endless rhythm beyond the barrier islands. It is peaceful, almost impossibly peaceful. That quietness encourages reflection rather than excitement. Perhaps that is exactly how history should be experienced, not as a collection of dramatic legends, but as a thoughtful conversation between the present and the past. Every generation asks new questions. Every generation discovers something different. The answers rarely arrive all at once. Instead, they appear slowly, one careful discovery after another. As evening settles across Roanoke Island once again, the fading sunlight paints the water with soft shades of gold and deep blue. The forests become silent except for distant birds returning to their nests. Stars gradually appear overhead, just as they did more than 400 years ago. Somewhere beneath the soil lie countless small reminders of lives once lived. Broken tools, fragments of pottery, pieces of forgotten homes. Together, they tell us something wonderfully simple. The people of Roanoke were real. Their hopes were real. Their struggles were real. And although history cannot fully explain where they went, it continues to remember that they were here. Perhaps in the end, being remembered is one of history's quietest forms of survival. In the next part, we will gently bring together everything we have learned, reflecting on the evidence, the mystery, and the enduring legacy of the town that was never seen again before our story reaches its peaceful conclusion.
As our journey through the story of the Lost Colony slowly nears its end, it is worth pausing, not to solve the mystery, but to appreciate it for what it truly is. History is often imagined as a collection of clear answers, dates, names, battles, victories, defeats. Yet, the farther we travel into the past, the more we discover that certainty becomes increasingly rare. Records disappear, buildings decay, voices fall silent. The passage of time gently removes details until only fragments remain. Roanoke is one of those fragments, not because it was unimportant, but because history does not preserve every chapter equally. When the settlers first arrived in 1587, they almost certainly believed their colony would become a permanent English community. They imagined farms stretching across open fields, children growing into adults, new houses appearing each year, ships arriving regularly from England with supplies, letters, and new neighbors. Their future probably seemed difficult but possible. Very few of them could have imagined that centuries later, people around the world would remember them not for what they built, but for the questions they left behind. There is a quiet sadness in that thought. History remembers their disappearance more clearly than their lives. Yet, perhaps that is changing. Modern historians increasingly focus not only on the mystery itself, but also on the ordinary people who lived through it. The carpenter shaping wooden beams beneath the afternoon sun. The farmer watching the first shoots emerge from newly planted fields. The mother comforting her child during a violent Atlantic storm. The fisherman repairing his nets beside calm evening waters. These people were not legends. They were families, neighbors, friends. Like all communities, they celebrated small successes. They worried about uncertain futures. They hoped tomorrow would be kinder than yesterday. That ordinary humanity is what makes Roanoke so enduring. It reminds us that history belongs not only to famous leaders, but also to people whose names rarely appear in official records. John White has become one of the best-known figures connected to the colony. His paintings, maps, and journals remain priceless historical treasures. Without his careful observations, we would know far less about the landscape, the indigenous communities, and the earliest attempts at settling North America. Yet perhaps his greatest legacy is something much more personal. He never stopped searching. Even after years of delay, even after crossing the Atlantic once again, even after finding the abandoned settlement, he continued looking for his family and granddaughter until circumstances forced him to leave. There is something deeply human in that determination. He was not searching for history. He was searching for family. That simple truth gives emotional weight to every page of his journal. Generations later, archaeologists continue that search in a different way. Instead of calling names through empty forests, they examine layers of soil. Instead of sailing wooden ships, they analyze historical maps and satellite images. Their methods have changed. Their purpose has not. They still hope to understand what became of the people John White left behind.
Every pottery fragment recovered from the earth. Every iron nail carefully cleaned in a laboratory. Every faded map examined beneath modern technology. Each discovery carries the same quiet question: what happened here? Perhaps one day, future excavations will uncover new evidence, a forgotten settlement, additional written records, objects that connect scattered pieces of the puzzle more clearly than ever before. History has surprised researchers many times before. There is no reason to believe every answer has already been found. At the same time, there is another possibility. The complete story may never be recovered. Time has a remarkable ability to erase even significant events. Wood returns to soil. Paper disappears. Buildings collapse. Memories fade. Nature patiently reclaims everything left unattended. If some questions remain forever unanswered, that does not diminish the value of the search. In many ways, the search itself becomes part of the history. Perhaps that is why Roanoke continues to fascinate people around the world. The mystery invites curiosity without demanding fantasy. It encourages careful thinking rather than impossible conclusions. It reminds us that the past deserves both imagination and honesty. We can picture what daily life may have been like. We can consider the strongest evidence. But we also accept the limits of what can truly be known. There is wisdom in that balance. As the evening sky darkens above the quiet waters of the Outer Banks, the same stars begin appearing that watched over the settlers more than 4 centuries ago. The tide continues its endless rhythm. The wind moves gently through the pine forests. Birds settled into the marshes for the night. Nature remembers nothing of mysteries. It simply continues. Perhaps somewhere beyond Roanoke, families once gathered around evening fires after another day of work. Perhaps children laughed while adults prepared meals. Perhaps the settlers found new homes and slowly became part of communities that welcomed them. Or perhaps history unfolded differently. The truth remains hidden, but the evidence gently suggests something hopeful. Not a sudden disappearance, not an impossible event. Simply people adapting to circumstances beyond their control, making difficult decisions one day at a time. If that is true, then the lost colony was never truly lost to itself. It was only lost to history. And there is an important difference between those two ideas. In our final part, we will quietly leave Roanoke behind and reflect on the lasting lessons this remarkable story offers about resilience, memory, and the quiet mysteries that remain woven into the landscape of history.
Our journey began with a quiet shoreline, a handful of wooden ships, families carrying everything they owned across an ocean that seemed almost endless. They were not searching for fame. They were searching for a future. More than 400 years have passed since those settlers first stepped onto the sandy shores of Roanoke Island. The world around them has changed beyond anything they could have imagined. The nation that would one day become the United States did not yet exist. The forests stretched farther than the eye could see. The Atlantic remained the vast and uncertain frontier connecting 2 distant worlds. Yet, even after centuries, one simple question continues to echo through history. What became of the people who disappeared from Roanoke? Throughout our journey, we have followed every clue that history has preserved. We stood beside John White as he returned to the silent settlement in 1590. We examined the carved word Croatoan left carefully on a tree. We explored archaeological discoveries made beneath fields and forests. We considered the strongest theories supported by historians today. And perhaps, most importantly,
We learn to appreciate the difference between evidence and imagination. That difference is what allows history to remain both honest and deeply fascinating. There is something comforting about admitting that we do not know everything. Modern life often encourages immediate answers. Every question seems expected to have a clear solution. History reminds us that some mysteries unfold differently. Sometimes the evidence survives only in fragments. Sometimes nature quietly erases the traces we hope to find. Sometimes ordinary people leave behind extraordinary questions. Roanoke is one of those questions. For generations, writers, filmmakers, and storytellers have imagined dramatic endings for the lost colony. Hidden kingdoms, secret tunnels, ancient curses, supernatural disappearances. Such stories can certainly entertain, but the real history, quiet though it may be, asks us to notice something far more meaningful. The people of Roanoke were not characters in a legend. They were parents carrying children across unfamiliar ground, farmers trying to grow crops in uncertain soil, carpenters shaping rough timber into homes, neighbors helping one another through difficult seasons. Their greatest challenge was not becoming famous. It was surviving another day. And perhaps that simple truth makes their story more powerful than any legend ever could. Today, many historians believe the most likely explanation is also the most human. When England failed to return, the settlers adapted. Some may have moved toward Croatoan. Others may have traveled inland. Some may have joined nearby indigenous communities, learning new ways to live while sharing parts of their own culture in return. If that happened, then the lost colony was never truly erased. It simply became part of a larger human story. A story of resilience, a story of cooperation, a story of people finding hope even when the future looked uncertain. Of course, complete certainty still remains beyond our reach. Archaeologists continue their careful work. New discoveries may yet appear beneath quiet fields or hidden beneath centuries of changing coastlines. Every excavation adds another small piece to the puzzle. Every generation asks new questions. History is never completely finished. It grows alongside our understanding. Perhaps one day someone will uncover evidence that transforms everything we think we know about Roanoke. Or perhaps the mystery will remain exactly as it is, a gentle reminder that the past still holds secrets beyond our ability to fully recover. Either outcome has value, because history is not simply about finding answers. It is about learning how people lived, how they hoped, how they struggled, and how their choices shaped the world that followed. Standing on Roanoke Island today, visitors hear many of the same sounds the settlers once heard. The wind moves softly through tall pines. The tide rises and falls along the quiet shoreline. Herons glide across the marshes. At sunset, golden light settles across the water before slowly fading into evening. It is an astonishingly peaceful place. Nothing about the landscape announces one of America's greatest historical mysteries. Perhaps that silence is exactly what makes it so memorable. The island does not demand attention. It simply waits, patiently, quietly, allowing every visitor to wonder. As darkness slowly settles across the Outer Banks, imagine the final evening of our story. The sky above the Atlantic is filled with stars. Gentle waves reach the shore with the same steady rhythm they have followed for thousands of years. Somewhere beyond the trees, a small cooking fire glows softly beneath the night sky. Children grow sleepy after another long day. Parents speak quietly about tomorrow's work. The world feels uncertain, yet life continues. Whether those families remain together, whether they found new homes, whether they became part of neighboring communities, or whether parts of their story have been lost forever, one truth remains unchanged. They were here. They lived. They dreamed. They worked. They loved their families, and they faced an unfamiliar world with remarkable courage. Perhaps that's the quiet legacy of the town that was never seen again. Not that it vanished without a trace, but that its people left behind something far more lasting than buildings or possessions. They left behind questions. Questions that encourage curiosity instead of certainty. Questions that remind us to respect history and the limits of what history can tell us. And perhaps, as you listen to the soft rhythm of the sea and imagine the peaceful forests of the Carolina coast settling into another quiet night, you can allow those unanswered questions to drift gently into the distance, like a ship disappearing beyond the horizon, leaving only calm water, a fading light, and the comforting reminder that some stories are beautiful not because every mystery is solved, but because they invite us to keep wondering. Thank you for joining this quiet journey through one of history's most enduring mysteries. May your evening be peaceful, your rest be deep, and may the gentle echoes of the past carry you softly into sleep.